Welcome, Ahmad, to the first of a number of conversations that I'm looking to have with some of my fellow Large Scale Scrum trainers. I wanted to start by saying it's an honour for me. I know I always say this to you, and you're probably sick of me hearing it, right? But I remember at the very beginning of my Agile journey, coming across some of your writing and hearing about you, and being able to get to know you over the years has been an absolute honour. So to have you here today and to get to interrogate you a little bit about your LeSS journey is something that I've been very much looking forward to. So thank you very much for obliging and coming along to this.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for the kind words. I appreciate it.
All deserved. All deserved. So if we could start by perhaps you sharing a little bit about your history, your experience, and kind of what and who you are and what you've done, just so we can let our viewers and listeners know.
Who I am and what I've done. I assume you mean just with specifically my career.
Perhaps, but you can keep it as whatever you're comfortable sharing, Ahmad.
Well, we'll start with career, and if you're interested in anything else, we can do that too. But so I started as a full-time software developer. I don't want to call myself an engineer. I wasn't an engineer back then. I did stuff with software at the age of 18. So I started full-time at a bank when I was 18 years old. And how I got there at 18 was that during the pre-dot-com bust, so around the late 90s, if you could spell HTML, you can get a job. And so I was a second-year engineering student at uni, and then found myself through a series of crazy coincidences working at Merrill Lynch, one of the biggest investment banks. And from there, jumped every year or so to different banks, basically trying to probably make more money, do more interesting things. And so by the time I was 21, 22, got married, and then thought that I should do what adults do and stop being a consultant and get a job, get a full-time job, and I got a full-time job at 21, 22, and continued being a software developer, and had a lot of crazy experiences in that I was never qualified at all for the job that I got. I never was qualified for the job that I was interviewed for, but I had developed this belief that I could learn anything because of the first time I got a job. I was also very underqualified. So I got this confidence I can learn anything very quickly. And so many times I'd be given assignments that I actually did not know what those assignments meant or what they wanted or what the technology behind them, but I always believed I could learn very, very quickly. Fast forward, joined the company, started moving up the corporate ladder. And back then, if you remember, in the early 2000s, being a software developer was not a good thing. It was the whole offshore movement was in full swing, and it was it was viewed as a commodity. And the most important job you could get is a manager, whether it's a dev manager, eventually becoming a project manager, program manager. That was the quickest path to director in a bank, at least. And so I took the advice of my manager, and he actually told me, get as far away from the technology as possible. Although I loved being a developer, but he said, this is not how you grow. You don't grow by being a developer. You grow by becoming a manager. And he was absolutely right for the context at that time. Offshoring was in full swing, and I did. I became a dev manager, became eventually a project manager, program manager. By the time I was 25, I was managing many, many, many people, and moved to London, became a Uber program manager, and was running strategic projects for Europe and the Middle East, and continued doing that. And until around 2005 or so, we hired, I'm saying my manager hired someone named Gordon Weir, who's just a brilliant change agent, one of the best change agents I've ever met. He's like this disruptive Kiwi person that I'd never seen anyone quite like him. Like,
Mm.
there'd be a meeting, and he'd just walk into the meeting because he felt the meeting was interesting. He's just like a disruptive change agent, you know. And in the beginning, had become fully British at that point. I was like, you know, became annoyed and cynical. I'd lost all my American, you know, thing. I became fully British and saying like, who is this guy? What's up with this guy? And all this kind of, who does
What
he think
happens
he
when you
is?
become fully British? You become cynical.
You become cynical and kind of angry, and you don't like Americans, or people say awesome, you know, things like that. But the reason I'm saying this entire backstory is it's at that point this guy Gordon brings in another guy who's Canadian and just unlike anyone I'd ever seen in my life. A guy named Craig Larman.
I've heard of him.
Yeah, you heard Craig? And
Yeah.
so I had never heard of Craig. This is a long time ago. I mean, I want to say this is when Gordon brings in Craig. I think it's like 2008 or so, or around. So quite a long time ago. Brings in this guy with the bolo tie, and I was at that point part of an initiative to change the bank, to help change the bank, because as a program manager, we knew that these large scale software projects were not working. So we're looking for better ways of doing things. We had this like really amazing CIO coming from Goldman, and he was changing the culture, and it was like a great time. But we didn't know exactly how to change from, you know, dinosaur to this new way of working. So it was an amazing time for me, because this is before like the Agile revolution took over the world, or ate the world. So I learned TDD from Uncle Bob. Mike Cohen was teaching us, you know, Agile software, estimating and planning, and Goico was teaching us SBE and impact mapping while he was coming up with a lot of these ideas. Like, he was calling impact mapping something else. And it was a really amazing time. And Craig was one of these folks. He was calling it effect mapping.
So is that,
and so
at the beginning
I had the class with Craig.
Oh, so I was going to say, in the beginning of the impact mapping book, he calls it effect mapping, but then said that Craig came up with the name impact mapping. Was that maybe then during that period?
This is exactly during the entire period, right? And I was really, really lucky and fortunate to be part of this little incubation period that was created by a really enlightened managing director named Lee Nichols, and facilitated by this other guy named Gully Patel. And so the combination of these three folks, Lee, Gully, and Gordon, gave us a lot of air cover to try a lot of really great things. And for example, it was during this period that the team self-design pattern was born. And I could not have been able to do something like that had it not been for that kind of air cover and that kind of incubator that was created. But so I meet Craig, and the first thing we do with Craig is a training. There was no LeSS. LeSS did not exist. It was Scrum as taught by Craig. Mm-hmm. And the acronyms LeSS did not exist back then. At least it wasn't advertised. It was just normal CSM training Craig. And I did not know you don't question Craig. You know, I didn't know Craig at this point. So I think I know my stuff. So I'm questioning him in class before I knew you're not allowed to really do that. So at one point in the class, he asked me, like, so what is it that you do? And so I told him what I did, and he said, wow, what a wasteful job. And he's like, that makes me sad, in his very Craig way. And whereas that really bothers people, it actually did not bother me at all. Like, I thought it was really interesting, you know, and why does he think my job is waste? And based on his own understanding of lean, it was not only waste, it was unnecessary waste. It was the worst kind of waste. And I became really impressed with not only his knowledge, but his ability to really disrupt. I mean, I'd never seen somebody so disruptive in positive ways and ultimately very negative ways as well. But I'd never seen somebody so disruptive. And then his lifestyle of minimalism and traveling really impacted me, and it resulted in me really shifting a lot, not just my career, and quitting the bank, but how I travel and live with my family, etc. And then, so that's it. Yeah, go
What a
ahead.
brilliant story. I don't think, maybe apart from that dinner we had many, many, many years ago, that I don't think I've really heard the story, and I've forgotten it since. So it's
Yeah.
brilliant.
Yeah. And then after that, I really almost, I think it was 2 years after meeting Craig that I quit and started doing this type of change work independently of the bank I was in. So
And you've,
that's a long-winded answer to your first
but
question.
it's
I'll
a
try
lovely.
to.
But look,
Sorry, go
it was
ahead.
a brilliant answer, and it was nice to hear. And it frames things really well, because I think the one thing that I've, and and maybe this wasn't one of the questions that I was going to ask, or one of the things I was going to say, but it's always struck me that between you and Craig, there's a great deal of respect, like mutual respect. And I
Yeah.
think that, at least from an outside perspective looking in, I've always seen that you two have a seemingly like great relationship, and I'm guessing that comes from part of a journey that you've been on.
I think it's because we've worked together and he's seen me do things, I've seen him do things, and there is a relationship that gets forged when you actually work on something together, as opposed to just having a mentor-mentee relationship, or he's Craig and I'm Ahmad. So we've worked together, he's seen me do things, I've seen him do things, and you develop a deeper bond that way. And I remember when I first met him, I was one of the many hundreds or thousands of people that he's met, and it was kind of like, all right, you could tell he had zero interest. And until I tried, he saw that I was taking some of the ideas that were at that point theoretical even,
Mm.
or he had heard had happened, and I was actually attempting them. And this, to tie things back, comes back to my early days as a software engineer. I'm willing, I have this belief I can learn and try things very quickly. And so when in the class he mentions that I think it was China, someone tried to get people in a room and form themselves, we tried it. And so he was actually really surprised that we attempted it. And I remember him telling me, "Where are you?" And I said, "I'm about to get on a plane to Ireland." And he said, "Okay, by the time you land, I want a draft of what happened." And so, just like, even though I don't work for him, I'm like, "Yes, Craig, it will happen." Sure, Craig. So yeah, and then he's also developed, like, almost like, he's become a very trusted mentor to me since then.
Mm. It was the team self-design work that's when I first came across you, and probably the first time I came across Craig as well. But I think it was you stuck in my mind more. I don't know why, but I mean that initial article really, was I read it, and then as soon as I could afterwards, I was there trying to practice it.
Yeah,
I did some research on it a few years back and found that the earliest, and maybe there are earlier recorded events like this, but the earliest I can find was a Lancaster bomber cruise in World War II.
yeah,
And I find that's even as much as I dislike kind of war stories, it's their sentiment is brilliant. And when I always I hold that in my mind, and I hold yours and Craig's work in my mind whenever I'm going to go and do one of these events, because I think it's always served me very well.
yeah. It's really, it's been 10 years or so since I wrote that article, and 11 years since the actual event, or something like that. And you realize that even before the bomber cruise, we grew up that way. We play basketball, it's all self-selected. We don't have it's very intuitive. And I've actually, the reality is, I don't know if it is better to self-select or have a manager select. And so, for example, if you go into the Premier League or any professional football club, the teams are not self-selecting. You have a manager selecting. And so what I've learned in experimentation is that I, nor almost any Agilist, truly knows if what they're doing is better than the alternative. It's all kind of gut feeling, anecdotal, that kind of thing. So although it's my my minor claim to fame, the team self-selection has been tried many, many times. I don't have any real data that says this approach is better than if a manager selects the team.
I mean, I think that's something that maybe we could get another conversation scheduled in for, because I've been studying team coaching, and you listen to some of the people that are kind of leading the charge on professional team coaching, and they'll say that team coaching is in the pre-theory stage, and they're still looking back to feel like family therapy and group therapy and counselling, and trying to draw things from other academic research to pull into team coaching to find what is transferable. And the one thing that I was on this course with my friend Philly Lander, and the one thing we began to realise was, we're in the Agile world, we've tried a lot of the things for a long time, but there's never been any rigorous data collection. We've never taken a en masse, that, as far as I'm aware, there's never been a proper rigorous academic approach applied to what we've done. And I think that actually we've got a huge amount of anecdotal information. But I wonder if it will get picked up by academia, and there will be some real solid research done into some of the things that we observe as being beneficial.
Yeah, exactly. Even things that we hold as sacrosanct, like XP and the work of Kent Beck, that really was just an experience report that he wrote from his time in Chrysler. I tried this, I tried that, I tried this, I tried that, and it was codified in this thing called XP. And people view that, or user stories, or things like TDD, or as better. And we actually don't know if they're better. Just because Uncle Bob and other people say this is better, or I say team self-selection is the better way of creating teams, we actually don't know, or we can't, other than faith and our gut and anecdotal evidence, say for certain any of this stuff is better.
I mean, this is what I find very interesting, and we'll move on to some of the other questions I want to ask you in a second. But what I find really interesting is I was going through the LeSS book again, the third one, recently, and at the very beginning it says that the principles and the frameworks are sacrosanct. We would ask you to follow those, but when it comes to the guides and the experiments, actually, if they don't fit and they're not bringing you improvements, then don't use them or change them. Yeah. And then when you begin to look really and say, well, hold on, how much of the types of things that people say, well, that's absolutely LeSS, how much of it is just a guide? And I think I've been guilty in the past of espousing things as sacrosanct when actually it's a guide. And in that respect, LeSS is very, very malleable. And I just find it interesting how I think the lines are blurred, and people tend not to take that stuff away from LeSS, which is, if there's a guide and it doesn't fit, it's not bringing you improvement, then don't do it. Like find another way.
Exactly. And that's just a measure of maturity, and that what's a guide, what's not. And the way I think about this is the LeSS rules. Mm-hmm. And people quote the LeSS rules like it's biblical. And even to me, the LeSS rules are guides. And and I know when I break the rules and when I should break the rules. And the way in which I think about it is, I remember when I first did my first triathlon and my coach sent me the plan. I treated the plan like I could not miss a session, as if I'm like an Olympic athlete, and I'm not. I'm an amateur. And my coach, Iron Mike, would send me something, and I would say, okay, I'm sorry, no matter what's happening, how I feel, I need to go swimming on Tuesday because it's in the thing. So now, been doing this for 15 years. I know exactly what to break, when not, what's an essential session, what's not an essential session. So I think the rules in LeSS are really important to an organization beginning a journey. But then, in my opinion, and this is only my opinion, this is not probably the opinion of Craig or Bas, almost every rule is meant to be broken.
I would be inclined to agree. There's a client that I have been working with, and they're incredibly complex environment. This is not. This is one of those environments where you look and you think, like, how is this ever going to work? And actually, with them, what they found was actually just looking at using Scrum well and factoring in a few of the LeSS rules. So not all of them, just taking a look at them and say, okay, well, which ones are we going to go for and which ones are we going to say later?
Yeah.
And actually, they came up with a really nice approach, and they seem to be doing very well with that. And they're saying, okay, well, then at some point in the very near future, we're going to tick a few more boxes. We're going to bring a few more of those on, and we're going to get used to them as well. But there is
Yeah.
in very complex environments, you can't. There's only so much change that we can take, or the system can take.
Exactly. And there's there are benefits to be gleaned from a lot of parts of less. It's like someone who's not willing to go vegan but wants to eat a lot more plants in their diet. Okay, they might not be vegan, but there is benefit for them having a lot more plants in their diet. And maybe in some cases you can't call some of the adoptions less, but you can take a lot of goodness from less.
Yeah. It reminds me of my really clumsy story, which I told it well once, and then have really failed to tell it well ever since. Your vegan one's much nicer than the one that I'll briefly share with you. But mine was always about Pumping Iron, the Arnold Schwarzenegger film.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah. And I watched Pumping Iron. And I'm like, that's what I've got to do. Like, I want to look like that. That's what I need. I need to do everything they're doing. And then so I was going to the gym a lot, and I just kept on hurting myself all the time. Yeah. And it took me years to realize that actually, maybe if I just took on bits of what they're saying, maybe if I looked at the diet, or maybe if I looked at the types of exercise they were doing, or if I built up to it slowly, then maybe, do you know what? I'm never ever going to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, but maybe I can feel happier and healthier, and maybe there's some things I can pick up, and then I'm on a brilliant journey. And this is what I will then say to clients: is say, well, look, like the less rules and the less frameworks. That's Arnold Schwarzenegger. You're never going to look like that.
Yeah.
But what can you begin to pick up and use along the way, and then you can make more useful decisions for you as you're on that journey to however you will look.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting analogy. I mean, is less and its rules and suggested experiments, are they even achievable? Because Arnold Schwarzenegger like physique is achievable to a very, very small. It is achievable, even greater than his physique, but very, very, very small selection of humanity. Is less the same, where it's only achievable for a very small select percentage of corporations?
I mean, it's interesting. Even though only a subset can have that physique, like, no one's going to look exactly like Arnold Schwarzenegger. This is part of, we're all different.
Yeah, and what's the analog or equivalent to, organizational steroids to even be able to? What is that? Maybe cocaine. I don't know.
Well, let's move. Looking at the news in the UK at the moment, there's a lot that could be said for that comment, but we'll move on perhaps.
Yeah, all right.
Right. There are some questions I'd like to ask you.
Sure, go ahead.
And this is the first one is you can pass on any of the questions. Don't feel obliged. But the first one is one that I've been asked recently, and I really liked it, so I'm interested, Ahmad. What is your elevator pitch for less?
My elevator pitch is I never pitch any organization to use less. I always recommend they don't use less. And that's always been my pitch. I say that, first of all, if you want deep, meaningful change and you're willing to go through extreme pain to get there, and it's going to take 2 years before you see some real fruit. And by real fruit, I don't mean teams standing up or post-it notes going up on the wall. I mean a palpable difference in the value creation of the organization. If you're willing to bear extreme pain, and you're willing to, and there's a real compelling reason to change, and not just because senior management said you should go agile, and you're willing to wait 2 years before you bear some fruit, then consider using something like less. So my pitch has always been not to use less. And that's been probably the most effective pitch I've found for organizations to use less.
Why do you think it's been
Because
effective? Is it simple reverse psychology, or is there something else going on?
it's not reverse psychology. I deeply mean it, and I have enough scars to know that the majority of organizations are well intentioned and want to change, but they're either don't have a real sense of urgency to change, or a compelling purpose to change, or by the very nature of companies, if you look at them systemically, since we're both less trainers, the majority of companies we work with take a quarterly view, which is to say they are a slave to, maybe slave is the wrong term, I shouldn't co-opt that term. They are they're very reactionary to the quarterly stock price of the company, which means taking very, very long horizon type change efforts is very, very difficult for most organizations, with the exception of some founder-led organizations. Some notable ones are Tesla, Amazon. It used to be Goldman Sachs because of their partnership model. But basically, the real thrust behind most of these organizations is efficiencies. They need efficiencies. And so they're not structurally created to be able to weather the storm of a two-year, I want to call it 2 years of pain or loss of productivity, etc. And so I think the reason the pitch works is it's authentic. It's authentic. I really tell people, choose safe, because it is safe for your careers.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen a lot of senior leaders get in trouble over trying to push less on the organization that either didn't really want it or wasn't ready for that kind of disruptive change. And so my advice for you from a career standpoint is don't use less unless you have a real, meaningful, compelling reason to change.
Reminds me of realization that I had a few years back, was that the best time to consider any of this is when you want to but don't need to. The moment you need to, then your motivations are going to be totally skewed.
Well, eventually all companies will need to change. And because, look, NFTs are reality. I mostly work with banks, and you can see the iceberg straight ahead. You see it, and it's getting closer and closer, and eventually there's going to be an incredibly compelling reason to change. And yeah, in many cases, it's going to be too late for some organizations to pivot. Some are starting to pivot right now. Some are really well-intentioned but structurally incapable. Some are not willing to make the sacrifices. It's almost like governments. Some governments are headed towards financial ruin, but they almost cannot make or bear to create the change required because they have to get elected in 2 years or 4 years. And so if they raise taxes and take away services and do all of the things required to write, they're not going to get elected. And there's a lot of the same dynamic in large organizations. Yeah, so my pitch to most companies is don't use less.
It's a brilliantly authentic pitch, but I think it helps because you're a brilliantly authentic person. I think it probably helps that it comes from you. I'm not sure if I'd be so successful in doing that.
You're very kind.
Well, I did when someone asked me the question. I said, well, I said don't use it. They're like, yeah, that's not going to work. Can you give me a better one? So then I thought, okay, well, if my life depended on it, how would I sell it? I came up with something which is apparently much better, but I could never repeat it. Anyway, you might have answered this question before when you were kind of giving your intro to yourself, but would you say that you chose less or less chose you?
I would say less chose me, just by virtue of bumping into Craig and really being impressed by Craig. And yeah, it was all happenstance. It was not, I did not go like searching or Googling for something. Gordon got Craig, and he had me at your waist.
I think it's there's definitely a pattern with this less trainers about the ones which I think ended up doing something which was less before less was less, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So here's one for you. There's a bit of optionality on this one. What's the one thing above all others you love or loathe about less?
I love the fact that less, and by less, there's no canonical way of teaching less, or I love that less puts a priority on thinking and teaching thinking tools. It's in a way, it's a framework that almost forces organizations to think.
Mm-hmm.
And the training is all about, or at least how I deliver it, and I know how you deliver it, it's all about really thinking and thinking about thinking. And so that's my favorite part of less. And so I'm not going to say systems thinking or queuing theory because that's too easy. I think the real aspect of less that I love is the emphasis on thinking and owning your own decisions, and not just saying, oh, you should have one product backlog, but really understanding why you should have one product backlog from a systemic perspective. And so that's probably my favorite part of less. And you said, which part do I loathe?
Well, if it was an option, you could choose love or loathe. If you want to do both, then that'd be brilliant.
And you mean specifically about the less community or the less framework?
I think you can take it as broadly as you would like.
Wow. What do I loathe? I think I'm going to pass on this one because
that's all right. It was an option. It was an option.
There are things that I do loathe, but I'll keep that for off the record between you and I. Yeah.
Noted. I won't push you on it. One thing I found interesting, the thing you love about less is the thinking aspect. I kind of feel that relates to your elevator pitch for less as well, because you can't go into this multi-year journey and think that you're not going to be able to avoid thinking.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I don't even, I shy away from even calling it less adoption in the companies I work in. I don't even use really the words less because I don't want something that they can point to and say, oh, that thing didn't work. Mm-hmm. Less didn't work for us. I want them to think through all the decisions, own them from first principles, and say, well, yeah, it didn't work. We decided, eyes wide open, we're going to try that thing, and that thing didn't work. And that thing could be one backlog, one product owner. But I know the temptation of calling the thing less gives you the organization one that's incredibly painful to say, just it didn't work for us, we need to try something else, or it was too much too fast, or wasn't pragmatic enough. And so I actually don't use the words a less adoption or we're adopting less, and so every decision, especially from an organizational design, is run through the people who own the transformation, and they decide if they want to do the thing or not through thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that when you try not to use the word less or mention any particular framework that people do ask, or it naturally emerges through the usage or through trying it?
Yeah, and I don't know why we as humans need to label things. I think there's I'm not a social psychologist, but we need to say we're doing CrossFit. We need to say we're going vegan. We need to say we're part of this tribe. We need to say we're trying less. So I have found that even when I've shied away from something, people need to latch onto a brand. I don't know the origins of this. I've seen it across multiple disciplines, but yeah, even when I shy away from less, they want to call it something. And if it's not less, they'll figure out some fancy internal name to call the change effort.
I wonder if is it a communication or an efficiency thing? Like we unless we can attach a label to something, then we find it more difficult to talk about it.
Maybe, or maybe it's novelty. We need to say like, we're I'm trying paleo. I,
But
I
I
don't know.
think
I don't know. Or
if you
maybe it does communicate a lot. Maybe it does communicate a lot with one word. Maybe there isn't an efficiency
yeah,
element in it.
I'm not sure. I mean, it is. I mean, I find it fascinating. I really do. I've got a feeling that I read something about it recently. I'll go back to a book, and I'll if I can find it, I'll let you know what I find. But when people who are, say, if they're ill with an undetermined illness, right, they know the symptoms and they got in treatment for it. But some people tend to say as soon as they get a name for it, it kind of makes them feel better. It gives them a way to talk about it a bit more. And I don't know if it is any way. This labeling is something inherent within us. We label everything. So
Yeah, I don't know.
to not label something maybe feels a little bit strange. Well, one thing we always try to do was just basically to call it our operating model. For example, at Deutsche Bank, we'd always say this is the operating model, and then say, which bits of it are less? And we're like, well, we understand less, and we've looked at it, and we've based the operating model on a lot of the ideas. But this isn't less. This is our way of doing things right now.
Yeah, yeah. But the flip side of that is it allows something to point a finger at. And the
Yeah.
same thing exists for a really charismatic change agent, which I think is a very dangerous thing. Like,
Mhm.
it feels nice if they say, "Oh, Ahmad's so great," he's just, and the problem with that is, I'm not great forever, and eventually they say, "Oh, he just screwed us up," he didn't do blah blah blah, and so having a brand name that underpins a transformation, or having a really high flying type coach that everyone likes to be around, that also creates the same danger. So I always try, having learned that in the beginning, as I went through my own ego trip, I wanted to be the person that everyone said is like, things are so much better after he came. And I realized that's a very dangerous and short-lived thing. You really want to be to, the secrets of consulting, Gerald Weinberg, you want to be the person in the background, that's almost through inception, giving people ideas and really almost getting none of the credit for themselves.
Yeah.
And I think it's
Yeah.
much more effective. And it's not just an ego. It's not like some sort of Buddhist Sufi thing. It's ultimately, for the longevity, it's much better.
Right, they say one of the quotes which has got me through like my I don't know, the last like 5 or 6 years of my career was the idea that you can achieve anything if you don't mind not taking credit for it.
Yeah.
And the
It's
moment
hard.
the moment I came at peace with that, or became more at peace with that, I think that I instantly became a happier, more engaged and aware person. Um,
Yeah.
and what you're saying about the charisma side of things, there's a book, Humble Leadership,
Mm-hmm.
by Edgar and Peter Shine. And then there they talk about the different types of leadership and the different types of relationships we need in modern organizations. And they do say that when the relationships are what they would call level one, when they're professional, there's not a lot of psychological safety, there's not a lot of trust, very professional doctor patient, lawyer client type relationships, then change initiatives will succeed or can succeed when you have those types of relationships, if you have a very strong charismatic leader to keep everyone corralled and heading in the right direction. But the moment that leader no longer exists, what you need is actually people who can work at a higher level of relationship where they can be honest and open and begin to solve their own problems. So I think that's being that personality driven change is very, very dangerous, and something that I know that I was absolutely the victim of, or the instigator of, over the years. And it's been a more recent change for me to kind of get over myself a little bit.
It's hard. And it's hard because it's not only hard from an ego standpoint, it's challenging from a commercial standpoint. So we're saying that we need to be in the background and working through other people. But then we also need to earn as independent consultants.
Mm.
So how do you balance that whole working through people and not being in the limelight, and then getting a contract or extending a contract, etc.? And what I have found is that at least for me, the more I work through people and seek less of the attention, the longer my gigs run for, the more I get suggested, etc. So it's counterintuitive, and I, learned that the hard way.
Well, it's a lesson you're not going to unlearn, I suppose.
Yeah,
Now, well, unless something happens to initiate that unlearning.
exactly.
So, last question specifically on less.
Okay.
What's been your favorite scenario where people have been trying something that could be less like? I'm trying to avoid the question of saying, what's been your the obvious question, what has been your favorite less adoption? Because I'm not a big fan of that language either. But what's been your most favorable experience?
Okay, so just for the sake, I will use the term just to. So, what's my favorite less adoption? So there's two ways of answering this question. What's been my favorite personally, and what's been most effective for the client. And so my personal favorite was probably that first one, because I just learned so much. And that first adoption, we were Craig and Mike Cohen and Goiko and Gordon and Gully and Lee and all these names, brought me back to that 18-year-old self. It almost like removed years of gumph, and there's like the idea of technical debt, organizational debt, but then there's like cognitive bias debt and gumph in my brain that I had accumulated over years of playing a corporate game and ascending and becoming director and all this kind of stuff, and wanting to become managing director. So from a personal standpoint, probably the most rewarding was that initial one. And it also changed the trajectory of my career. I quit after that. I changed the design of my life, what I was trying to pursue, my balance with my family. And so that's a profoundly meaningful adoption for me on a personal level. From a client standpoint, what's been the most valuable? I think there was a adoption I worked on in Chicago, and I could see the lives of the product team improving. Like I can see them happier. Like when I got there, it was just like really dull gray, at least in my mind's eye as I'm thinking about this. I just felt like Gotham or something, like inside the building, people just, it's probably raining inside too, and how I'm thinking about it right now. And within, I want to say, a year, it was bright, there was life, there was buzz. And I remember, and I have a series of questions that I ask to see if things are getting better. And one of them is going to the real product owner, and saying, do you think you're getting more value out of the product development organization? And he said, absolutely. He's like, I'm getting a lot more value. And what I'm finding above all else is that the contentious relationship we had, where I would ask for something and the change control procedures and that war, we call it the contract game, but he doesn't use that the terminology. He's like, I don't have that anymore. Like I tell them I changed my mind, and the thing changes. And I was like, yeah, that's the point of the whole thing. And he's like, oh, if that's the point, yeah, things are better. But so not only there was more value from the product owner, that's probably the tertiary benefit for me. That the primary benefit is like people just seemed a whole lot happier to be at work. So that particular one is probably a highlight for me from a customer standpoint, as opposed to a personal.
Was that the happiness? Was that something which you just observed, or did you try and calculate that in any way? Just out of, I know it's maybe an odd
Yeah.
question, but I know that people will maybe be thinking along those lines.
Yeah, I eventually tried to quantify it. I I went through this whole stage in my life or my career where I'm like, oh, this is all anecdotal. I need to become more grown up. And I looked into things like the happiness ladder and ways in which I can quantify happiness and I realized it's just really, really incredibly difficult.
Mm.
And I would just ask people, are things better? Are you happier at work? Because when I tried to quantify it, and I remember this, I try, I tried to calculate this and quantify it in a bank. And I one of the questions was, are you more happy, same happiness, less happy, or something like that, just as to gauge the team's happiness. And what I ran into was some cultural issues. Like when I was like did the roadshow of these metrics, some guy in England was like, "What do you mean by happiness? Like, what does that word mean?" Like the Americans had like they didn't have, but some of the English
I
had
say
this
cynical,
like
aren't we?
this allergic reaction to like, what do you mean by the word happiness? And and like and so yeah, again, short answer, I just asked. Long answer, I've had difficulty in gathering real data around happiness.
It's a fascinating one. It's a fascinating one because it is one of those things which you can see. But I do find that there's been plenty of times when I've been in contexts where we've been using less and trying parts of it, and people have seemed happier. Rather frustratingly, then it's always the less happy voices which
Yeah,
seem to be the loudest. It's interesting. People, but particularly maybe it's maybe more of a British thing as well. But people are less inclined to stand up and say, "Do you know what? I'm happier. I'm actually happier than I was before. This is brilliant." People are much more inclined to stand up and say, "Do you know what? All this isn't actually that great. I'm not very
yeah, and
happy
that
with what's happening here."
having lived in Britain for 12 years, I love the fact that there's a culture of raising your voice. Again, this is all my own personal experience. I love the fact that in Britain people are much more to your face around how they feel. When I first got there, like, why are people so aggressive and hurting my my feelings? But then I've come to really value that. But it's also worth saying that you cannot introduce change into an organization and expect everyone to be happy. I was
Yeah,
specific to say after a certain period of time, but during introducing a new order of things, not many people are very happy, except the fringe that were like, oh, we've been waiting for this forever, like, and come to life, and most likely will become coaches in the future. But the majority of people, the uncertainty, the here we go again, this is another change effort. Yeah, there isn't a lot of there isn't a lot of happiness in the beginning.
no. Yeah, and that's and if people are looking to use less to get instant happiness, then maybe this is not the case. But I've always argued that this is the same with any large change effort. If you, I mean, I've been involved in when I was particularly at Royal Bank of Scotland, there was so much huge change that was happening. As the organisation slowly contracted, as the realization that we were majority owned by the UK citizens, right, we were bailed out by the taxpayer as that increasingly dawned and the large changes just kept happening and happening and happening, no one was particularly happy about it.
Yeah, it's a ton of uncertainty, a ton of what does this mean for me and my family? Am I going to have a job at the end of this?
Yeah.
And that's one of the things less hits at the core of a person's identity sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Because what is it that less says is that the roles go from a couple dozen to three, maybe four. And then so you immediately think, so where do I fit into this? And no matter how much we say there's uh, job safety, not role safety, those words are in one ear, out the other.
Yeah.
And so you say, okay, so I was a QA manager and I played the game right for 20 years and became, director or whatever as a senior QA manager and have an entire team of offshore QA people, and I've done everything right. And now you're telling me there's not only the QA role as we understand it, this external QA role. Where do I fit into this? Do you want me to be a developer? Do you want me to be a scrum master? And so there is a lot of, I've grown to have a ton of empathy for people going through this type of change.
Yeah, and I think you're right. The job safety, not role safety, is a difficult one because for some people, that if their role changes and they don't want that job anymore, and people can't, aren't willing to go on a journey, and it's a difficult one for people. I think that empathy is a huge thing.
Yeah,
We have to remember that, and this is one thing I always try and remind myself, is that you look back through the history of an organization that's just full of people who have just tried their best. You look at what's happening right now, it's just full of people who are trying their best. And in the future, probably people will continue to try their best. And it's difficult to go in, and people start getting these ideas for certain changes they want to make, and they say, "Well, don't worry, you'll still have a job." It's like, well, like you're saying, I've just done my best, and now my job doesn't really exist in the same way or at all anymore. So what journey do I have to go on? And I think this is where, if putting agile coaching to one side, I think real professional coaching to help people in these difficult, and challenging career decisions is massively important. And this is one of the interesting things I picked up from around the pre-theory on team coaching around my tutors at Henley. And they were saying that for a long time, they believed that from a coaching perspective, it was challenge and then support. But actually, when they begin to look at things now, particularly team coaching, it's provide support before challenge. So what support mechanisms can we put in place for people before we go on this, before we even begin to say, we're going to change this, or we're going to look at how we're going to model our product, or what the definition of done, and how the structure is going to change. How do we put in some support mechanisms so that people have people to talk to, and that people don't feel pushed out of an organization that they put their all into for a long time?
And, we need to think more about this, because there's going to be a lot more of this. If you just look outside even of our industry and where our society is going, there's going to be a lot of people displaced. Let's just say 10 years from now, and all these drivers are going to be, whether truck drivers, I forget how many people are employed by truck drivers or are truck drivers or drivers in urban areas. And all of a sudden, they're not going to have automation will do away with that. So it's not just going to be I feel like it's this roles going away is going to accelerate in the next 10 years dramatically. And and people really are going to have to contend with it. And so, it's going to be an interesting decade that we're in.
Yeah, it'd be like a very, very large, long, less adoption, perhaps.
Yeah, and things are, like, all of this global stuff that's happening, whether pandemics and all this kind of stuff, is just accelerating the inevitable. Like, I always, when talking about my children to my wife, and I always tell her, like, the most important thing we have to instill in them is, after character, is the ability to learn very fast.
Yeah.
Because things are constantly changing. Like, I'm trying to wrap my head around NFTs now for a couple of months, and I think I finally get it. And then something else changes, and like, if you really want to get it, you need to understand smart contracts or DAOs. It's just, the world is, as a techie, I feel like a Luddite, and it's just moving so incredibly fast.
It is, and this is, well, hopefully, I would love it if if more people really got and embraced a lot of the things we've been doing for years, because I feel that that ability to learn quickly, I think we've got a lot to offer the world, and a lot to offer children, students. I think there's a lot we can be teaching earlier in people's academic careers around different ways to do it. Perhaps we need to get some of that academic research in place so that it becomes more accepted.
If your point is really valuable. If kids are just taught systems thinking, and I actually you know the fifth discipline, right? Which is like
Yeah.
the book or one of the books on systems thinking. I actually did a thing with my kids called the fish discipline, and used fish and plastic and what's happening with just throwing away plastic in the ocean and how that's impacting fish, and we're actually eating it in sushi.
Mm.
There's like a degree of plastic in every sushi bite we eat because of we're just throwing plastic everywhere, and the fish are eating it. And really what I'm trying to do is teach them systems thinking, not just this narrow cause and effect
Mm.
type mentality they're taught in school. And so if one thing children, academia, or especially young kids can learn about from LeSS, it would be systems thinking, or viewing the interconnectivity of things.
And I would add to that I think that we like kids. I think we need to people need to be taught more about what it is to work as an actual team. Because I think that well formed, well working teams full of happy people are naturally thinking systemically, because it isn't about you anymore. You're
Yeah,
thinking about your teammates, and you're thinking about what's coming up, and you're thinking about what's going on for these people in their outside lives. And I think we naturally become more inclined to think systemically when we're working with others. But schools, at least to my understanding, still seem to be reasonably focused on smart individuals
yeah,
rather
yeah.
than kind of looking at things collectively. And I think we miss a trick with these things.
Well, and we're also, if you look at children today, they are learning those skill sets by through video games, not through
Yeah.
school. I mean, watch them, and I'm really blown away sometimes watching them play video games with their friends and organizing. So terrified a little bit, but also like they are self-organizing. They're doing everything natively that we're teaching organizations. You know, they're maybe for just to capture the flag or to blow up, maybe not for the best purposes, but they are learning those things outside of school.
Yeah.
And so what we're missing is teaching those things for more effect, teaching those set of skills inside of school for better purposes.
Mm-hmm.
But our children are living in two worlds: the 200-year-old world, dated world at school, and then a completely different reality outside of school.
Mm-hmm. I mean, to bring it back to LeSS for a second, I think this is why, for me, this is one of the reasons why LeSS is quite brilliant when it works well, is because it unleashes really powerful teams. And I think that's fantastic. But then I find that's also one of the biggest challenges, because organizations talk a good game when it comes to teams. Most of them don't really understand what that means. People don't understand really what a team is and how you teach teams differently. But then added to that, it's the one thing that LeSS, and I know, it's interesting, and this is something that I've always kind of confused and unconfused myself periodically with, is it's this idea of strong team identities, because it isn't about making a strong team which then ignores the broader system and does what they think is best. It's making a team which is systemically aware, and works well with the teams, because you can have the best team in the world, but they won't be the best team in the world if they are alienating themselves to the broader system. And this is where you want strong teams, and you want teams with a good identity, but that identity can't be at the cost of them actually working well as part of the broader system.
That's why it doesn't work if you don't have a really compelling, really good product owner to bring those teams together. Because it's, teams are inherently insular, and we want them to be systemic. But when they have a mission, most of the times they're focused on that mission. At least this is, and maybe there is a maturity level I haven't yet seen where they're systems thinkers. But I think that's where the really strong product owner comes in, is it to really remind the teams of the greater system. And that's really probably the role of, and I hate to bring him up because he's the new Steve Jobs, but that is the role of Elon Musk, and that's how he at least describes his role, and he uses the term subsystem optimization, which is another way of saying local optimization, and his job is to create the environment where teams avoid subsystem optimizations because it can be catastrophic in SpaceX. And so, yeah, I mean, there's one thing about creating a great team, which I agree with, but then making them system aware until they reach that level of maturity. I think that's where having a great product owner comes in.
Well said. Well said. So two final questions.
Sure.
And let's keep these. Let's see if we can keep these ones brief, because I'm not sure.
Time box me.
Well, all right, yeah. I say keep it brief, only because I know how things will go if it's me and you, and then we'll just talk and talk and talk. Okay. I'll do my best to time box you. So, what's something in the Agile world from times gone by, or even in the present day, that you feel should have been more popular than it was?
What's something that should have been more popular than it was? It's not something, I think it's some people.
Okay.
I think that the old guard, and can I use that term? I feel like I'm going to get myself canceled. I think there are people in the Agile world that, for whatever reason, are not more popular. And I think they should be, because you and I are like, we're the latecomers, right? But there are people who've been doing this for a very, very long time that have a pedigree and have knowledge that's very, very valuable to the community and very valuable to us as coaches. And so, like, Cope. Mm-hmm. I think Cope is somebody. I think Tom Gilb is somebody that, for whatever reason, whether they rub you the wrong way or people don't like their styles, I think they deserve to be more popular, or not they, their messages deserve to be more popular. Alistair Coburn, the OGs of the Agile community. And I think there are some people who are too popular for the value they provide. And so, yeah,
I won't ask you to name names. It's fine.
Yeah, I think because it's a beauty pageant sometimes. Who's the most likable, who's the best presenter at a conference. And I'll tell you a story about Cope and my first interaction with him. So he curates something called the Scrum Plop, right? Very, very valuable resource. Again, not sexy, but very valuable. And so I didn't know much about the pattern language. I had come up with the team self-design pattern and had been tried a bunch of people, but had been tried successfully, quote unquote successfully. So I sent it to him, to Cope. I don't know him. I just emailed it to him. And he emailed me a response that was like War and Peace. Wow. Really. And basically at the end of the response, he said that this lack of rigor should be in an academic environment is cause for dismissal.
Yeah.
And he's like, he basically said, you tried something, nobody died, and now you want fame for it. And he actually did. Well, similar to Craig, people like that, I feel I can see past the ego, and like, I can learn something from this person. And so even if he says things that can rub people the wrong way, that's irrelevant. I think the community is lost a lot by drowning out the voices of those people.
Brilliant. And what was that resource you mentioned? Scrum.
The Scrum Plop.
Scrum Plop.
Yeah, you should put in the show notes.
I will put it in the show notes.
It'll be in the show notes.
Look at that, you've arrived now, been able to say that. I'll put it in the show notes. Anyone wants to check out what that was, and
you've arrived when you can say this is sponsored by Squarespace. Then you've arrived.
This podcast will never be sponsored. It's at least that's my plan. Let's see how things work out. Okay, so Ahmad, thank you very much for taking this time to
My
talk
pleasure. Really,
to talk to me. Right? I mean, it's been brilliant. You've answered the questions so well, and I feel like I know you even better than I did before.
yeah, it's really fun.
I suppose just to wrap things up, I would love to get you on the Less Matters community at some point in the next few months, so maybe we can talk about
Sure.
dates. And I'd love you to share. I know I've spoken to you about maybe talking to one of my clients, but perhaps doing some for the Less Matters community on your Gemba sprints, because I think that's something of huge value. So maybe we can
I'd
get
love
some
to do
dates
that.
for that. And so yeah, really to end it all, I mean, what's coming up for you, Ahmad? What is it you'd like to share with the listeners and the watchers?
I'm working on another explainer video for Gemba Sprint, similar to the one I did on Team Self-Design, and it's really meant to get the idea out to a leader or manager in 3 minutes or less. And they're really hard to do, to get the key idea down to 3 minutes, and they're expensive to do. But I'm looking to get that out in the next 2 weeks.
Okay, and where could we find that and your previous video?
Everything on my website, ahmadfahmy.com, AHMADFAHMY.com.
Right, we'll type that in the show notes as well.
I'll drop in the show notes. Awesome.
And anything else? Anything else you got coming up? No?
Just no. In terms of things I want to get out there, that's probably the immediate next thing I want to get out there.
Brilliant. But I can't wait to watch it. And thank you again for taking this time.
Take care.
Bye-bye.